Hello, everybody. Welcome to the podcast. Today, I will speak about the three-act structure in storytelling. What is the three-act structure? The three-act structure is kind of a way to, it's kind of like a guidance, it's almost like a recipe in a certain sense for structuring a story, and knowing like what kind of thing should follow what. So let me try to explain what I'm trying to say. So if you watch like so many, if probably every single of the Hollywood movies that I've watched in that I can remember, ever since I kind of learned about this and started looking for it and paying attention, follow the three-act structure. And it's just a way to tell a compelling story. And by compelling, I mean a story that kind of draws you in emotionally and involves you and invests you, such that you care. And like a lot of times you're watching a movie and it's you're just not like, you're like, yeah, whatever. But sometimes you watch a movie like, whoa, that's interesting. I wonder what will happen next. And that is because that's when they got you. And so the three act structure is a way to kind of it's a guidance tool to give you a hand to help you out and say, okay, usually the way I heard it described in the book Save the Cat by Blake Snyder, which again is referenced that book in the last episode of the podcast, and I probably would keep mentioning it. Um, if you think of like a story, especially a 2 hour long movie, it's a it's a long time. A lot of things happen in 2 hours. You need a 5 minute movie. You would think you could get away with just like a couple things or whatever. But imagine trying to. It's kind of like when when I was like in college or something, and they asked me to write an essay that's like 10 pages long or something. So a 2 to 3 page long essay, especially if it's double spaced, you can kind of BS, like you can kind of say things over and over again and just repeat them and just say them in different words and so on and so forth. But a 10 page essay, at a certain point, they're like, all right, you're not giving us any content here whatsoever. And it becomes noticeable. And that's why, and so in like a 2 hour movie, that's what happens. You really cannot get away with BSing the content because it's just too long. People are going to notice. So that's why the three act structure is there to kind of give you. You ever play Mad Libs, where it's like this little thing that people play. Comes in like a notebook, and it's played with two people. So well, you could play it by one person. So what you do is, uh, the one holding the notebook has like a list of questions. So it'll say one adjective, one noun, one verb, one adjective, or whatever. And then, so you who's holding the notebook, ask the other guy, say, okay, give me one adjective. So he says, all right, uh, fast. He writes fast. Give me one noun. So he says tree. All right, tree. He writes that down, and at the end, those words kind of are used to fill in the blanks of a random story, and because you gave those attributes at random, and it's going to be very funny. So it's like, once upon a time there was a fast chair, because you had to say, you said fast, but you didn't know it had to do with a chair. You get it. So this is what that is. It's kind of like, it's like the blanks where you can put your own ideas, but in structure, really, so many stories are very similar. Now, I hope I've given you some kind of general framework and impression of what the three act structure is. Now let me get into it a little bit more in actual detail. So Um, all right. So I guess in short, um, the three act structure is you have act one is obviously I'm going to, explain these things, but you got to bear with me. Act one is the setup. Act two is the exploration, and act three is the resolution. In act one, you basically put in place uh, certain conflicts. So like you put in place the concepts and the ideas that, and by concept and idea I know I'm using a very general vague word, and I'll get to that. You put in place the concepts and ideas that you will explore throughout the rest of the movie, or the story rather. This is for stories in general, not just for movies, obviously. um so in let me try to think of a movie. Can't remember, but in act one what you do is you kind of start hinting at things. You start showing, it's like an introduction. It is an introduction. It's an introduction to your essay. Then act two is like, all right, now let's get into the heart of it. Let's get into the meat of the essay. And then act three is like where we kind of wrap everything, all that we answer all the questions. Um, so if you think of in Judaism we have what's called divrei Torah, which are just kind of like um, ignore that. Those who know what a Dvar Torah is and kind of try to pay attention to what I'm saying will maybe find an interesting thing here. But imagine I'm giving you a lecture on something. So I first I start with the the basic context. You came to a lecture. You don't know anything about what I'm going to talk about. So I tell you the context. I explain to you. Imagine this is a topic you know nothing about. So I explained to you the basics of the concept. So now you're like, all right, I think I have a grasp for what you're discussing. But that's not why you came to the lecture, because then what I'm going to say is, hold on a minute. Remember what I just told you? That this, thing A that I just told you about has such and such things? Well, there's actually something interesting. It's not always this way, or there's something that contradicts that. You're like, wait a minute, all right, now we have a conflict. So here we just introduced we set the setting and the characters, and now we introduce the conflict and say, remember when everything kind of made sense? Well, if you look just beneath the surface a little bit more, things don't make as much sense. That's act one. Act one is like, it's like a ripe, juicy peach that you're gonna bite into. It's like an enticing peach. It's like, ooh, look at that peach. And then act two is where you actually uh, get into it and start eating this peach. Um, then act two is where we actually um, so act one is where we kind of give the context, the setup, and we introduce a conflict, but we don't address it yet. That's act two. In act one, we just introduce it. Act two, what we do is um, we say, all right, let's get into it. Let's try to understand. Let's try to understand. Let's grapple with this contradiction. Grapple. Act two is all about struggle, conflict. Well, not conflict, but struggling with that conflict. In Act two, we would say, all right, let's think about let's grapple with this concept and the problem that you raised, and how does this make sense? And let's think about this, and let's think about that. And it's struggle, and it's drama, it's conflict, and then right at the end of Act two, the point which takes us, which kind of is the intersection between Act two and three, is where we kind of find the answer. It's like, aha, that's the answer. And then, we're kind of saying things, and then someone says something like, wait a minute, what did you just say? And then Act 3 is where we kind of review the whole problem and we start answering every question based on that key insight that we got um, after a long time of struggling with the conflict. Um, so that's kind of it in a certain sense. We have Act 1 is the setup, and Act 2 is the actual addressment of that setup. We set up the conflict in Act 1, we address it, the conflict in Act 2, and we resolve it in Act 3. And the points where you kind of go from Act 1 to Act 2, the point where, what's the transition point between Act 1 and Act 2? Transition point between Act 1 and Act 2 is when when we take a step forward and we take an assertive step and say, let's do it, let's deal with it. You have to show assertion, and proactiveness and accountability and determination. That's really the key to a compelling story, is a character that's motivated, that wants something, and goes out and does everything possible to attain it. So just to kind of recap what I'm saying, Act 1, we introduce a problem, and in Act 2, in the Act 2 break, I think, or Act 1 break, yeah, I think it's called Act 1 break. The break between Act 1 and Act 2, that moment is where the character finally says, you know what, I've had enough. Let's deal with this. You know, let's deal with this. And yeah, and then he kind of, deals with it, but it's not easy, obviously. Because if it were easy, then it wouldn't be a very interesting story. The harder it is to deal with the problem, then the more there is to talk about in the story. And finally, the Act 2 break is where he kind of gets that key insight, which he then uses throughout Act 3 to unlock all of the uh, all of the locked doors he discovered throughout Act 2 that were preventing him from reaching the conclusion in Act 3 and the resolution, which is what he sought. Just a couple more things. Sometimes they're called the thesis, the antithesis, and the synthesis. Thesis is what it is. Antithesis is the antithesis, is completely against and the opposite of the thesis. And the synthesis, to synthesize something, means to join it and unite it, is synthesizing. It's actually taking the thesis, and the antithesis is taking the yes and the no and somehow blending them into something that encompasses both and transcends both. Um, so in future episodes, we'll most likely talk about this, but um, if it weren't, you get a great amount of satisfaction in Act 3 when kind of everything's being resolved. But if you think about it, you could not have that satisfaction had you gone from um, it's like they say, if you woke up and uh, and everything was resolved for you, then like there would be no story to tell. Imagine a story where I tell you, one day I woke up and I was so well rested, and then I got dressed, then I went to school and I was on time, and all my classes were good, they were easy, I succeeded, and then I got home and I had a great day and I slept and I got up the next morning, and I keep going like that, and everything's just going perfectly smooth. Eventually you're gonna be like, all right, well, where's the story? Start the story already. I'm like, what do you mean? I've been telling you a story. They're like, no. And there it is. There is when you realize what a story truly is. The story is the fight and the resolution of a conflict. In order to overcome an obstacle, first you need to have, you know, an obstacle, right? Which you can overcome. But in order to have overcome an obstacle, you need to have first the baseline, um, to notice an obstacle. Because if everything, you know what I mean? Like an obstacle implies two things. It implies kind of a baseline, and then it implies something that is counteracting that baseline, which is why it's an obstacle. It's, you know, it is not keeping us. It is keeping us from having that, you know, kind of pleasant baseline. And then once you overcome that obstacle, then you're happy and proud of yourself, and things like that. Okay, everybody, I know this was very perhaps abstract. Because it is, in a certain sense, abstract. We're talking about the very structure of stories, the meta structure of stories. Not, you know, this happens and then that happens and that happens. But in a certain sense, the pattern that all stories that I know of in Hollywood, again, that I know of, so I believe Shakespeare uses like 5 act structure, which I don't really know what that is. But as far as I know, most, you know, ever since I started paying attention to this, I have never really found a Hollywood story that that I didn't think fit into this. I mean, some were weaker than others. Whatever. I don't really know. I don't know. But enjoy. And I guess just to leave you with something practical. Next time you're watching a movie, um, notice that at the beginning, and I'm not talking about like so much a sequel or whatever, because even though those are supposed to have the same thing, but I think it gets a little bit more confusing. But next time you're watching a movie, notice that at the beginning we're kind of uh, introducing this character and their world, and we're starting to hint at and we're starting to show there's conflict. So we'll notice how we'll see them interact with their friend, and then we'll notice like a certain like little fight, but that's not resolved. You know, it might look like it resolved, but underlyingly it just kind of was swept under the rug. You'll notice how the filmmakers are kind of throwing out all these little crumbs of conflict, and then it's super exciting when you notice this. The act one break, you'll notice the character finally is like, I've had enough, and he takes an assertive step forward and he says, I'm going to deal with all this. And that is the act one break. And when you see it, you're like, man, that's wow. I can't believe, like, once you start to see it, you see it everywhere, and it's like, that's crazy. Like, it's been right there, and I understand it so intuitively, but I never saw it, you know, clearly. Um, I never realized that I was seeing it. Okay, yeah, well, there's a lot more to talk about, obviously, and this would become abundantly clear if I were to give you practical examples, but maybe that will come in the future. Now I just kind of wanted to talk about the structure itself. For further reading, uh, see Save the Cat. That's obviously a foundational one, or for a Jewish, what do you call it? A Jewish book that talks about this, is called Living Inspired by Akiva Tatz, Tatz. So that's Akiva space Tatz, and he doesn't talk about it, as far as I'm aware, in the context of stories, but he says that this pattern of Act One, Act Two, and Act Three, which again he doesn't refer to by that name, is a recurring pattern in life. And so go check it out. Would love to answer any questions you have, uh, which I hope you'll have, because if you were paying attention, you'd be thoroughly confused. See you on the next one.